If I told you that the smartest people on Earth, like literal rocket scientists, leading economists, brilliant physicians, are biologically wired to ignore objective facts that could save lives, you would probably think I was exaggerating.
Oh, definitely. It sounds like a complete exaggeration.
Right. I mean, we operate under this assumption that human intelligence is this tool designed to uncover the truth. But today, we are looking at a stack of neurological research, behavioral science, and clinical psychology that proves something deeply, well, deeply unsettling.
Unsettling is exactly the word.
Yeah. So the data shows your brain is not a truth-seeking computer. It is a prediction machine. And it is a prediction machine designed to protect your ego at absolutely all costs, even if it has to manufacture a completely alternate reality to do it.
It is a profound realization when you dive into this research, because we just assume that, when presented with undeniable evidence that we're wrong, a smart person will simply update their beliefs.
That's the logical thing to do.
Right, but the data shows the exact opposite. When highly intelligent people are presented with facts that contradict their deeply held beliefs or their past decisions, they don't change their minds. They actually become more committed to the wrong path.
Wow.
Yeah, because the brain's priority isn't objective reality. Its priority is psychological survival.
And that is the central paradox we are exploring today. So, welcome to everyone listening. You are embarking on a deep dive into the hidden architecture of your own mind.
We're going to cover a lot of ground today.
We really are. We are pulling from clinical trauma research, the behavioral economics of decision-making, and a harrowing historical analysis of NASA's Challenger disaster.
It's a really intense stack of sources.
It is. And our mission here is to uncover the unconscious mechanisms that trap you in toxic patterns, the biological reasons you are essentially forced to lie to yourself, and ultimately how to use evidence-based clinical therapies to break free.
Which is so needed.
Absolutely. So let's start with the biological hardware. We all know the term cognitive dissonance. It gets thrown around constantly to describe, hypocrites. But the research from Leon Festinger in 1957 suggests this isn't just a philosophical flaw, is it?
Not at all, no. Festinger's theory completely rewired our understanding of a human motivation because he identified that cognitive dissonance is an evolutionary biological drive.
Like hunger or thirst.
Basically, yeah. Humans have a fierce need for internal psychological consistency. Your beliefs, your values, and your actions must align, or the prediction machine just breaks down.
Okay, give me a concrete example of that breakdown.
Well, take a passionate animal rights activist who suddenly realizes the medication they rely on is tested on animals. Or think about a person who considers themselves a highly rational judge of character, but they find themselves deeply entrenched in a relationship with a covert narcissist.
Oh, that's a powerful example. Someone who's being emotionally manipulated?
Exactly. The reality, which is, I am being abused, directly contradicts their core identity of, I am too smart to be manipulated. When those two realities collide, the brain registers it as a literal existential threat.
Because if the prediction machine is wrong about something that fundamental, it implies the machine can't be trusted to keep you alive.
That's exactly it.
So how does the hardware actually respond to that threat? If I'm that person and someone points out the contradiction, what is physically happening in my head?
Modern neuroscience, specifically functional MRI imaging, has mapped this beautifully. It is not just an abstract sense of confusion. Dissonance triggers a region of the brain called the anterior cingulate cortex.
The ACC.
Yes, the ACC. It acts as your brain's conflict monitor. It's constantly scanning your environment and your internal state for discrepancies. And when it detects that your actions are violating your beliefs, the ACC lights up and communicates instantly with the anterior insula.
The anterior insula, what does that do?
So the anterior insula is crucial here. It is the region responsible for interoception, which is your awareness of your internal bodily states and the processing of emotional and physical pain.
Wait, are you saying that when someone points out a flaw in my deeply held political belief or tells me my partner is toxic, my brain processes that contradiction using the exact same hardware it uses to process, touching a hot stove?
Precisely.
That is wild.
It is. The anterior insula takes the logical contradiction and translates it into a literal physical feeling of pain.
So that hot flush of defensiveness you feel in your chest.
Yes.
Or that sudden spike of rage or that sickening pit in your stomach.
That is not a personality quirk. That is your brain hitting you with a dose of intense emotional pain to force you to resolve the inconsistency.
So the brain is essentially torturing us until we fix the contradiction.
That's one way to look at it, yeah.
And I assume the easiest way to fix the contradiction would be to just admit we were wrong and change our behavior, right?
Well, that would be the logical way. But changing behavior requires admitting massive failure, which is its own kind of psychological trauma.
Right, nobody wants to do that.
Exactly. It is vastly easier and takes far less cognitive calories to simply change reality. We justify, we rationalize, or we completely block out the conflicting information.
I really want to dig into how we proved this physical arousal aspect, because the sources detail a landmark study from 1974 by Zana and Cooper. And we don't need to get bogged down in the textbook definition of dissonance, but this methodology is absolutely wild.
It really is one of the most elegant psychological experiments ever conducted. Zana and Cooper wanted to prove that cognitive dissonance isn't just a logic error, but a genuine state of physical arousal driving our behavior.
Right.
So they recruited a group of university students and had them write essays arguing forcefully against their own deeply held personal views.
Which is the classic way to manufacture cognitive dissonance in a lab. You force someone to act against their beliefs, their ACC sounds the alarm, the insula creates that awful pit in their stomach. And normally, to relieve that pain, the person will unconsciously shift their actual opinion to match the essay they just wrote. They rationalize it.
Right. They convince themselves, I guess I didn't actually disagree with this view that much, just to stop the internal pain.
Yeah.
But Zana and Cooper introduced a massive variable.
But placebo.
Yes. Before the students wrote the essays, the researchers gave them a placebo, a simple sugar pill.
But they manipulated what the students expected the pill to do.
Exactly. They split the students into 3 groups. They told Group A, this pill will make you feel incredibly tense and physically uncomfortable.
Okay.
They told Group B, this pill will make you feel deeply relaxed. And Group C was told the pill would have no side effects at all.
Okay, so they all write the essays, they all experience the intense biological pain of cognitive dissonance. What happened to the group that thought the pill was making them tense?
The results were staggering. The participants in Group A who were told the pill would cause tension did not change their original beliefs at all. They didn't rationalize, they didn't shift their opinions.
Because they had a scapegoat for the physical pain.
Exactly. Their brain felt that terrible pit in the stomach, the ACC was screaming, but the conscious mind said, oh, I'm not experiencing an existential crisis because I'm a hypocrite. This physical discomfort is just a side effect of that pill.
Wow.
Because they could attribute the physical arousal to an outside source, the psychological need to rationalize their behavior completely vanished.
That is deeply unsettling. I mean, it implies that all of our grand, complex rationalizations, the intricate stories we tell ourselves about why we stay in bad jobs, why we tolerate emotional abuse, why we double down on bad investments, it all just stems from the brain desperately trying to find an excuse for physical discomfort.
It completely strips away the illusion of pure rationality. And, the neuroscience goes even further. The sources point out what happens in the brain when you successfully rationalize a conflict.
What happens?
Let's say you are a smoker and you read a terrifying study about lung cancer. The pain hits. But then you construct a rationalization like, well, my grandfather smoked until he was 90, so I must have good genetics.
Right, we've all heard that one.
The moment your brain accepts that lie, the left frontal cortex activates, and your brain's reward centers release a surge of dopamine.
Hold on. If I'm understanding the causality here, the brain detects a truth that hurts the ego. It creates pain. We invent a lie to protect the ego, and then the brain rewards us with dopamine for lying to ourselves.
Yes. You are chemically rewarded for successfully deceiving yourself.
But that implies a horrifying cycle. If we get a literal dopamine hit for rationalizing, aren't we biologically addicting ourselves to our own self-deception? This isn't just a flawed prediction machine. This is a machine that gets high on its own supply of denial.
That is a very dark but highly accurate synthesis. We become chemically incentivized to reject reality. And you see this addiction manifest in distinct patterns.
Right, the research outlines a few of these traps.
Yeah, several ways this cognitive dissonance traps us. We experience belief disconfirmation when new evidence shatters a worldview, which often leads to the victim aggressively attacking the source of the evidence rather than evaluating it.
Like shooting the messenger.
Exactly. Then there is induced compliance, where we are forced by social pressure to do something we hate, so we convince ourselves we actually enjoy it just to avoid feeling weak.
And the sources heavily highlight effort justification, which seems incredibly relevant to toxic dynamics.
Oh, absolutely.
If you pour massive amounts of emotional labor into trying to fix a broken partner, you cannot tolerate the reality that your effort was wasted, so you unconsciously inflate the value of the partner. You tell yourself, they are just misunderstood, their trauma makes them special, our bond is unique.
Yes, you have to make the prize seem infinitely valuable to justify the excruciating effort you spent trying to attain it.
It's just so heartbreaking to see that mapped out clinically.
It is, and that is very closely linked to post-decisional dissonance. Have you ever noticed how someone who spends months agonizing over which car to buy will suddenly become fiercely defensive of the car the moment they sign the paperwork?
Yes. The day before, they were listing all the flaws of the transmission. The day after, it's the greatest feat of automotive engineering in human history.
Right, because once the decision is locked in, the brain can no longer tolerate the ambiguity. The possibility that they made a $30,000 mistake is too painful.
So they just rewrite reality.
Exactly. The prediction machine artificially inflates their affection for the choice and systematically blinds them to any flaws in the vehicle, completely eliminating the lingering doubt.
Which is terrifying when you scale it up. If we are biologically addicted to rationalizing our past decisions, what happens when those decisions aren't just about a car, but about our careers, our life savings, or our marriages?
That's where things get dangerous.
Right. If I'm addicted to a bad choice and the left frontal cortex is demanding that I maintain this lie, how does this manifest in my actual behavior?
It manifests as a doubling down. This bridges us from the internal invisible world of cognitive dissonance into the external destructive world of behavioral economics.
Okay.
When the internal tension of a past mistake becomes too great, we fall directly into the sunk cost fallacy.
Okay, we've all heard the term sunk cost, usually in the context of forcing yourself to sit through a terrible movie because you already bought the ticket.
Right, the classic example.
But based on the research from behavioral economists like Richard Thaler, Hal Arks, and Catherine Bloomer, the neurological reality of this fallacy is much more severe than just a bad night at the theater.
Vastly more severe. A sunk cost is any past investment money, time, emotional energy, physical labor that is entirely unrecoverable. It is gone.
It's gone.
Rationally, any basic economic model dictates that a past cost should have zero influence on a present decision. When you are deciding whether to stay in a movie theater or leave, the only logical factors are the future costs and the future benefits.
Right. Will the next hour of my life be better spent in this dark room watching a bad film or outside doing literally anything else?
Exactly. The money is gone either way. The prediction machine should just calculate the highest probability of future happiness. But the prediction machine completely breaks down when it calculates past data, doesn't it?
It breaks down catastrophically because humans suffer from an intense loss aversion.
Yes.
To leave the theater is to definitively acknowledge the loss of the ticket price. As long as you stay in the seat, the loss remains ambiguous in your mind. You tell yourself, well, maybe the third act will pull it all together.
Which it rarely does.
Exactly. You are spending a non-renewable resource, your future time, to try and retroactively validate a past mistake.
And the sources mentioned a fascinating study by Jonelle Stroff on this exact phenomenon, looking at how different demographics fall into this trap. And the results are completely counterintuitive.
They really are. You would think older people who might be more set in their ways would be more vulnerable to sunk costs. But Stroh found that younger adults are significantly more susceptible to throwing good time after bad.
Yes, and the psychological mechanism behind that finding is deeply poignant. It comes down to how the human brain perceives the landscape of time.
Okay, how so?
As people age, their temporal horizon shrinks. They become acutely aware that time is a finite, rapidly dwindling resource. Because they value their future time so highly, they become far less willing to sacrifice it merely to justify a past mistake.
That makes so much sense.
A 70-year-old will walk out of a bad movie after 20 minutes because they intuitively know they don't have hours to waste.
But a 25-year-old feels like time is infinite. They have boundless future resources, so they're willing to burn an entire afternoon just to avoid the momentary psychological sting of losing $15.
Exactly. But we must be careful not to view this purely as an individual low-stakes quirk. The sunk cost fallacy scales up to destroy international economies. Look at the classic macro example, the Concorde fallacy.
Oh, the supersonic passenger jet. The joint venture between the British and French governments. This is the ultimate example of brilliant minds utterly failing to process objective reality.
It is the defining case study. Long before the Concorde ever took its first commercial flight, the financial models clearly demonstrated that the jet would never be profitable.
Right.
The fuel costs were too high, the sonic boom limited its flight paths, and the passenger capacity was too low. The objective data screamed at the governments to abandon the project.
But they had already spent millions.
Millions, which turned into billions. The investors and politicians literally said, "We have already invested too much to quit now."
It's painful to even hear that logic.
They couldn't face the political humiliation and the psychological pain of accepting the sunk cost. So to avoid admitting they wasted millions, they chose to waste billions.
I'm struggling to reconcile this with the idea of pure economics, though, because with the Concorde, it feels like there's something else at play beyond just the money. You mentioned political humiliation.
Yes, that's key.
The sources make a sharp distinction here between the sunk cost fallacy and what researcher Barry Emstou calls commitment bias, or the escalation of commitment.
That is a vital distinction. Sunk cost is ostensibly an economic trap, an inability to process wasted resources. But commitment bias is a purely social and psychological trap.
Okay, break that down for me.
Stau's research reveals that the escalation of commitment is driven almost entirely by the desperate need to save face and maintain a public identity.
So it's not the money, it's the ego's terror of social stigma.
Exactly. Imagine the profound blow to a CEO's self-esteem or a politician's public image to stand up in front of their stakeholders and say, "I was wrong. My vision was flawed. I made a terrible call."
Nobody wants to do that.
No one. The emotional need driving commitment bias is the preservation of reputation, both internally to oneself and externally to the peer group.
This is where the trauma and toxic relationship dynamics snap into brutal focus for me. If I spend 10 years married to someone who systematically diminishes my self-worth, and I finally wake up to the reality of the emotional manipulation,
Yes.
the sunk cost part of my brain says, I can't leave. I've invested my youth. I've invested a decade of effort. But the commitment bias part of my brain is saying something much darker, isn't it?
It is.
It's saying, if I leave, I have to admit to my family, my friends, and myself that I was foolish enough to be conned for 10 years.
Yes. The victim stays, not because they still believe in the abuser, but because the psychological toll of admitting the deception is perceived as the fatal blow to their identity. They cannot stomach the idea that their previous emotional investments were a total waste.
Wow.
The thought, "I wasted the best years of my life," is simply too agonizing for the anterior insula to process. So the brain manufactures a rationalization. It wasn't a waste. This is just a season of hardship. If I just communicate better, if I just try a little harder, they will change and it will all be worth it.
They literally throw away their future to protect the narrative of their past.
It is cognitive dissonance weaponized against the self. You endure active, ongoing harm today to avoid the grief of yesterday's mistake.
It's like realizing you are reading a fundamentally broken, awful book, but instead of putting it down, you force yourself to read it 3 more times, annotating the margins, just to prove to the people on the subway that buying it was a genius move.
It is exactly like that. The drive to appear consistent overrides the instinct for self-preservation.
But let's escalate this. It is an individual tragedy when one person throws away a decade on a toxic relationship or a bad career path to save face.
Right.
But what happens when you put 10 brilliant, highly rational people in a room and they all simultaneously experience this terror of being wrong? If individual cognitive dissonance causes us to double down, what is the compounding effect when an entire organization of elite minds experiences shared dissonance?
When the prediction machine fails at scale, the result is groupthink. And it is arguably the most dangerous psychological phenomenon in modern history.
We hear the term groupthink constantly in corporate buzzwords. People use it to mean, oh, we had a boring meeting where everyone just agreed. But the actual psychological architecture of groupthink, as defined in the sources, is not about boredom. It's about fear, isn't it?
It is about profound systemic fear. The term was coined by research psychologist Irving Janis in 1972.
Oh.
Janis defined groupthink not as mere conformity, but as a severe deterioration of mental efficiency, reality testing, and moral judgment that results from in-group pressures.
So they actually lose their ability to think critically.
Completely.
Yeah.
It is a pattern of flawed decision-making, where the desperate drive for unanimous agreement within a cohesive group entirely obliterates their ability to realistically appraise risks.
It is an autoimmune response of team culture. The team's biological desire to protect its own harmony ends up destroying the team from the inside out.
That is the perfect way to conceptualize it. The analysts identified that groupthink doesn't just happen randomly. It requires a specific incubation environment.
Like what? What are the ingredients?
You need a highly cohesive, insulated group people who respect each other deeply and feel a sense of elite exclusivity. You need high external stress, severe time constraints, and usually a directive leader who strongly hints at their preferred outcome.
Okay, so a pressure cooker.
Yes, a pressure cooker. Under those specific conditions, the individual brains in the room stop trying to find the truth. They unconsciously pivot to a collective rationalization. If we all agree, we share the liability. Safety is in numbers.
And there is no more harrowing, thoroughly documented example of this in the sources than the morning of January 28, 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster.
It's a tragic, perfect example.
When you look at the credentials of the people involved, NASA executives, aerospace engineers, astrophysicists, these are the smartest analytical minds on the planet. And yet the decision-making process the night before that launch is a textbook, fatalistic case study of groupthink overriding physics.
It is a devastating tragedy, precisely because it was entirely preventable. The data was there. The truth was in the room. To understand how groupthink blinded them, we have to look at the specific dialogue and the environmental pressure of that night. NASA was under immense stress. The launch had been delayed multiple times.
And the political pressure was huge, too, right?
Immense political pressure.
Yeah.
President Reagan was scheduled to mention the launch in his State of the Union address, and the weather at Cape Canaveral was dropping to unprecedented lows. It was expected to be below freezing at launch time.
Which terrified the engineers at Morton Thiokol, the contractor that manufactured the solid rocket boosters.
Terrified them. The engineers knew that the massive rubber O-rings, which formed the critical seals between the segments of the rocket boosters, had never been tested in temperatures that cold.
Right.
The engineering data strongly suggested that the extreme cold would cause the rubber to become stiff, brittle, and incapable of sealing the superheated gases during ignition.
So the engineers do what they are supposed to do. They halt the machine. They organize an emergency teleconference with NASA management the night before the launch, and they explicitly argue against launching.
Yes. They presented the data. They pleaded for a delay.
But the group dynamic immediately crushed them. Let's walk through the specific symptoms of groupthink that Janice identified, because every single one of them infected that teleconference, starting with the illusion of invulnerability.
NASA, at that time, possessed an almost mythological status. Since the tragic Apollo 1 fire in 1967, they had executed a string of 55 successful manned missions.
They felt untouchable.
Completely. They'd put humans on the moon,
Yep.
they had launched space stations. The internal culture had developed a profound sense of untouchability. The scientists, the management, and the American public all operated under the unconscious belief that NASA could simply do no wrong.
Their past success became a blinding sunk cost. They thought, we are the people who beat the Soviets. A little ice isn't going to stop us.
Exactly. This overconfidence fundamentally skewed their reality testing. When the Thiokol engineers presented the O-ring data, NASA management didn't view it as a fatal flaw. They viewed it as a nuisance, a minor hurdle that their inherent brilliance would somehow overcome.
Which leads directly to the second symptom, pressure on dissenters. And the sources highlight a specific, chilling piece of dialogue from that teleconference.
It's hard to even read it now.
When the engineers refused to back down and kept pointing to the data, a senior executive at Morton Thiokol, feeling the immense pressure from NASA, turned to the vice president of engineering and told him to, quote, take off his engineering hat and put on his management hat.
That phrase is the death knell of critical thinking.
Yeah.
It is raw, overt pressure to abandon objective reality.
It's just so blatant.
It is. Taking off the engineering hat means literally ignoring the physics, ignoring the data, ignoring the truth. Putting on the management hat means prioritizing the schedule, the institutional momentum, the public relations, and the group harmony. It was a direct command to conform to the group's desired outcome.
It's the ACC conflict monitor being manipulated in real time. The executive is basically saying, if you keep holding up this launch, you are no longer part of the in-group. You are an outcast. And for a highly cohesive group of engineers, the threat of being exiled from the team was more psychologically painful than the threat of ignoring the data.
Yes, and that intense social pressure triggers the next symptom, self-censorship and the illusion of unanimity.
What does that look like in the room?
Well, the dissenting engineers, facing a wall of hostility from both their own management and NASA, eventually exhausted their psychological capital. They stopped fighting. They went quiet.
And in a room infected by groupthink, silence is immediately weaponized.
Precisely. In a healthy culture, silence means people are thinking or they are unsure. In a groupthink scenario, silence is automatically interpreted as consent.
Wow.
Because the engineers were no longer actively screaming stop, the leadership instantly concluded that a unanimous consensus had been reached to proceed with the launch.
There was also the presence of mind guards, right? Janice defines these as members of the group who appoint themselves to protect the leadership from adverse information.
Yes, individuals in the communication chain who actively filtered out the severity of the engineers' warnings before they reached the absolute top-tier decision-makers.
So they never even heard the full truth.
No, they didn't. The mind guards rationalized it by thinking they were saving the leaders from unnecessary stress, but in reality, they were insulating the group's fragile consensus from the sharp edges of reality.
And reality always wins. 73 seconds into the flight, the exact scenario the engineers predicted came to pass. The brittle O-ring failed, superheated gas escaped like a blowtorch, the external fuel tank ruptured, and the shuttle disintegrated.
It was a horrific loss.
7 astronauts, including Krista McAuliffe, the first civilian teacher in space, were killed. The sources note the reaction of retired Space Shuttle Commander Dick Covey, who reviewed footage of the disaster years later for a documentary.
Yes, Covey's reaction grounds this entire theoretical discussion in the devastating human reality.
What did he say?
Well, he is watching the footage, listening to the mission control audio, and you hear the voice over the comm say, "Major malfunction." Even decades later, witnessing that moment, Covey's face registers sheer, profound disbelief.
Oh, wow.
It is the moment the artificial reality manufactured by groupthink shatters against the unforgiving wall of physics.
The cost of the collective ego protection was immeasurable. The drive to eliminate the discomfort of disagreement in that boardroom was literally stronger than the drive to keep 7 people alive.
It's a sobering realization.
It is. So if I'm a listener and I'm horrified by this, how do I stop it? If I am leading a corporate team, or even just sitting with my family trying to make a major financial decision, how do I inoculate the group against this psychological disease?
You have to engineer deliberate, structured friction into your decision-making process. Groupthink thrives on momentum and harmony. You must disrupt both.
Okay.
First, the sources suggest assigning a formal devil's advocate. This cannot just be someone casually raising a concern. You explicitly mandate one person whose only job in the meeting is to viciously attack the consensus, find flaws in the logic, and argue the counterpoint.
That is brilliant because it removes the social stigma. If my job is to attack the idea, my ACC doesn't register the conflict as a threat to my status in the group. I'm actually fulfilling my role by being difficult.
Exactly. You institutionalize dissent. Second, you must bring in outside experts who have absolutely no emotional investment in the group's past decisions or sunk costs.
So they don't have that commitment bias.
Right. They won't suffer from commitment bias because their identity isn't tied to the project.
Yeah.
Third, if you are the leader, you must withhold your opinion until the very end of the discussion.
Because of the gravity of the leader's opinion.
Yes, the moment a leader says, "Here's what I think we should do," the gravity of the room shifts, and the group will unconsciously bend their arguments to align with the leader.
And the sources mention scheduling second chance meetings, which I find fascinating. What is the psychological function of a second chance meeting?
It breaks the artificial urgency that fuels groupthink. The rule is that no final binding decision can be made in the initial meeting.
Okay.
The group discusses, debates, and reaches a tentative conclusion. Then everyone goes home. You mandate a cooling off period, you sleep on it. The next day, or a week later, you reconvene with emotional distance and clarity with the explicit agenda of asking, are we absolutely sure about this?
You give the prediction machine time to reset without the immediate, intense social pressure of the boardroom.
Exactly.
Okay, so we have mapped how this desperate need to avoid the pain of being wrong scales up. It causes massive organizational disasters, it traps us in toxic relationships, it bankrupts governments. But here is the massive hole in all of this that I am struggling with.
What's the hole?
If the human ego is this fragile, if the ACC is constantly sounding the alarm every time we make a mistake, and the insula is constantly punishing us with physical pain, how do we ever survive a normal day?
That's a great question.
Because life is a constant, unrelenting barrage of evidence that we are flawed, incompetent, and making mistakes. If we had to violently rationalize every single tiny error just to survive, our brains would literally melt. How does the mind absorb all these micro-failures without triggering a total existential crisis every morning?
That brings us to one of the most elegant, paradoxical defense mechanisms in the entire field of psychology. Self-affirmation theory, developed by Claude M. Steele in 1988.
Okay, what did Steele figure out?
Steele recognized the exact problem you just identified. If the ego shattered every time it was wrong, humanity couldn't function. So Steele asked a radical question. What if humans don't actually have a psychological need to be right about everything?
Wait, everything we just discussed for the last 40 minutes proves that we hate being wrong.
We hate the threat that being wrong poses to our identity. But Steele proved that the specific argument isn't what matters. What humans actually possess is a fundamental drive to maintain their global self-integrity.
Global self-integrity, define that for me.
It is the overarching holistic belief that you are, generally speaking, a good, moral, competent, and capable person who has control over their outcomes.
Oh, I see.
As long as that massive overarching narrative of I am good person remains intact, the brain can actually absorb specific failures and contradictions without panicking.
So the ego isn't a single fragile pane of glass. It's a mosaic. If one tile gets smashed, the picture is still mostly intact.
That is a phenomenal analogy. And this leads to the core mechanism of Steele's theory, which researchers call the fungibility principle.
Fungible, meaning interchangeable.
Exactly. Steele discovered that the sources of our self-worth are interchangeable, meaning you can offset a massive, terrifying threat to your ego in one specific area of your life by artificially boosting your value in a completely unrelated area of your life.
I need a concrete example of this because it sounds like psychological accounting.
Let's use a classic clinical example. A man goes to the doctor. He has smoked a pack a day for 20 years. The doctor shows him a chest x-ray and gives him terrifying, undeniable proof. Your lungs are deteriorating. If you do not stop smoking, you are going to die.
That is a massive hit of cognitive dissonance.
Massive. The man's identity as a rational, self-preserving adult is under severe threat. The logical response is to process the fear, admit the 20-year mistake, and quit smoking.
But quitting is incredibly hard, and admitting you've actively poisoned yourself for 2 decades is devastating to the ego.
Right, so the prediction machine looks for a shortcut. Instead of dealing with a health crisis, the unconscious mind utilizes the fungibility principle.
What does he do?
The man leaves the clinic, and suddenly he starts deeply affirming his values in an entirely different domain. He tells himself, you know what? I am a deeply devoted father. I coach my daughter's soccer team. I am a brilliant, dedicated architect. I provide for my family.
Hold on. He's literally saying, I might be actively destroying my respiratory system, but I'm great at AutoCAD and I love my kids, so overall, I'm still a good person.
Exactly. By flooding his brain with affirmations in the parenting and career domains, he restores his global self-integrity. The ledger is balanced.
Wow.
And here is the tragic part. Because he restored his global sense of worth, the specific threat of the lung cancer no longer feels like an existential crisis. It shrinks from a terrifying reality into a minor, tolerable flaw.
So he just ignores the doctor?
He doesn't actually refute the doctor's evidence. He just buffers his ego against it so heavily that he completely loses the motivation to change his behavior.
That is horrifying. It is literal psychological accounting. We have this internal bank account of self-worth, and we unconsciously believe we can deposit a good deed from our family life to pay off the massive overdraft of a toxic habit in our health ledger.
It's exactly like that.
But if we do that, aren't we just giving ourselves a free pass to be complete hypocrites? If the brain allows us to use this loophole, if we just keep transferring funds from one ego account to another every time we mess up, we will never actually confront our flaws. We will never change.
You have hit on the exact danger of the human condition. We are trapped in a biological machine that prioritizes comfort over growth. We have mapped the entire prison today.
We really have.
The literal physical pain of cognitive dissonance in the insula, the escalation of commitment where we throw years of our lives into the sunk costs of toxic relationships, the echo chambers of groupthink that blow up space shuttles, and this endless, fungible loop of the ego's self-affirmation rationalizations.
So how do we break the machine? We are trapped in a prediction engine that gets a dopamine hit for lying to itself.
Yeah.
How do we ever actually rewire our brains to escape this and face reality?
The answer lies in a highly specific, empirically validated branch of clinical psychology. To escape the trap, you cannot try to outsmart the prediction machine. You have to change the rules of the game entirely.
Okay, how do we do that?
We do this through a framework called acceptance and commitment therapy, widely known as ACT.
ACT. I have seen this gaining massive traction in the clinical space, specifically for trauma and anxiety.
Yes, it's incredibly effective.
The sources note it was developed by Stephen C. Hayes in the 1980s, building on B.F. Skinner's behavioral theories and relational frame theory. But without getting a PhD in behavioral psychology, what is the actual mechanism? How does ACT defeat cognitive dissonance?
It defeats it through a radical paradigm shift. Think about traditional cognitive therapies. Often they teach you to identify a negative, flawed thought, analyze it, and try to change it or argue against it to prove it wrong.
Right. If I have the thought, I am a failure because I stayed in a toxic marriage, traditional advice is to argue with myself. No, you aren't a failure. You learned a lot. You are strong.
But what did we learn about the anterior cingulate cortex? When you argue with a thought, you are creating conflict. You're treating the thought as a literal truth that must be defeated.
Oh, so fighting the thought just engages the conflict monitor.
Exactly. It spikes the insula and creates more cognitive dissonance. ACT proposes something deeply counterintuitive. Stop fighting the thought. Stop trying to change it. Stop trying to eliminate it and simply accept it.
That sounds like giving up. If my brain tells me I'm a massive failure who wasted 10 years on a sunk cost, you're saying I shouldn't defend myself.
The goal of ACT is not symptom reduction. The goal is not to feel good. The goal is psychological flexibility.
Break that down. What is psychological flexibility?
It is the ability to stay fully present in the current moment, to observe your thoughts and emotions without defense, and to consciously choose to align your behavior with your true chosen values, rather than letting your emotional pain or your need to protect your ego drive your actions.
So instead of reacting to the insula's pain by rationalizing, you just sit with the pain and do what you value anyway. The sources use a fantastic juggling analogy for the 6 core processes of ACT. We don't need to number them like a checklist, but I want to understand how these processes actually interact in real time. Because sitting with the pain of being wrong sounds impossible.
It is incredibly difficult, which is why it requires practice. Imagine these processes as balls you keep in the air. The first movement is pure acceptance. This means dropping the resistance.
Okay.
When the ACC sounds the alarm and you feel that hot flush of shame or anxiety over a mistake, you don't fight it. You don't try to use the fungibility principle to remind yourself you're good at your job. You simply allow the physiological response to exist. You make space for the grief, the regret, the anxiety.
You essentially say, yep, there is that awful pit in my stomach. I am feeling it.
Yes, and the moment you accept the physical sensation without trying to rationalize it away, you can engage the most unique and powerful mechanism in ACT, cognitive diffusion.
Diffusion, like diffusing a bomb.
Exactly. Normally, we are fused with our thoughts. If you think, I am an imposter, you view that thought as a literal, objective reality that dictates your identity. Cognitive diffusion teaches you to distance yourself from the thought.
How so?
You start viewing the thought not as reality, but simply as a passing neurological event, a string of syllables generated by a prediction machine.
But how do you actually do that in the moment? When I am spiraling, a thought feels incredibly real.
Yeah.
How do I strip a thought of its power?
The clinical techniques are fascinating because they often involve deliberate absurdity to break the cognitive frame.
Right.
Let's say you are plagued by the thought, I am unlovable. It feels heavy, dark, and absolute.
Right.
ACT might instruct you to take that exact phrase and sing it out loud to the tune of Happy Birthday.
Right.
Or say it in the voice of a cartoon character.
Mhm.
Or repeat the word unlovable out loud as fast as you can for 60 seconds.
I feel like if I sat in my living room singing I am unlovable to the tune of Happy Birthday, I would feel utterly ridiculous.
Which is exactly the point. By changing the context of the thought, you strip it of its semantic meaning. When you repeat a word 50 times, it stops being a devastating psychological truth and just becomes a weird sound your mouth is making.
Oh, wow.
You aren't arguing that you are lovable, which would cause dissonance. You are just turning the threatening thought into a harmless passing jingle. You diffuse the bomb.
That is brilliant. You are bypassing the ACC completely. You aren't giving the conflict monitor anything to fight. And once the bomb is diffused, how do I actually move forward?
You ground yourself in the present. Dissonance almost always lives in the past, like I made a catastrophic mistake, or the future, like I will be exposed and humiliated.
So you have to pull yourself back to right now.
Yes, ACT forces you into being present through intense mindfulness. You focus on the physical reality of the room you are in. It stops the endless loop of what-ifs, and that leads to a profound shift in identity, which ACT calls self as context.
How does that differ from the self-affirmation we talked about earlier, where the smoker just says, I'm a good dad?
Self-affirmation is about protecting an inflated ego. Self as context is about realizing you are not your ego at all. It is the realization that you are not your thoughts, you are not your emotions, and you are critically not your past mistakes.
Okay.
You are simply the conscious observer of those experiences. You are the sky, and your thoughts, your sunk costs, and your groupthink failures are just the weather passing through.
If I am the sky and not the storm, then admitting I wasted 10 years in a toxic relationship doesn't mean I am broken. It just means a massive storm passed through my life.
Exactly.
It untethers my core identity from the mistake. That completely destroys commitment bias. If my identity isn't tied to the past choice, I don't have to defend it anymore.
Exactly. The need to save face vanishes. And once the ego is out of the way, you can focus on the final pieces of the puzzle: values and committed action. You must clearly define your personal standards. What kind of person do you actually want to be? Not what does society want, not what protects your reputation, but your deep intrinsic values.
And then taking action based on those values. Yes, but the critical nuance of committed action is that you take concrete steps aligned with your values even while you still feel anxious. You don't wait for the cognitive dissonance to completely fade.
Right.
You don't wait for the fear of leaving the toxic relationship to disappear. You take the fear with you, you accept the physical discomfort in your insula, and you walk out the door anyway.
If I tried to synthesize this entire journey,
Yeah.
if our cognitive dissonance is this terrifying, snarling monster pulling us into a tug of war over a bottomless pit of anxiety, our biological instinct is to dig our heels in and pull back as hard as we can.
Yes, we fight it.
We rationalize, we recruit groupthink, we rely on sunk costs, we furiously transfer funds in our ego accounts just to pull the monster closer to our side. But ACT isn't about pulling harder. It's the realization that you don't have to win the tug of war. You just have to open your hands. You just drop the rope.
Robe.
The monster might still be there yelling at you, but you are no longer tethered to it. You don't have to fight your own mind. That is a deeply beautiful, accurate visualization of psychological flexibility. The human mind is a flawed prediction machine that is terrified of being wrong. It will manipulate reality, it will waste years of financial and emotional investment, and it will follow the crowd off a cliff, all just to avoid the momentary physical pain of admitting a mistake.
Yeah.
But we are not slaves to the machine. We can learn to tolerate the discomfort of being wrong. And learning to sit with that discomfort without reacting defensively, without rationalizing, is the only true path to freedom.
So to you, the listener, as you go through your week, the next time you feel that sudden hot flush of defensiveness in an argument, or that sinking, agonizing pit in your stomach when someone questions a major life choice you've made, remember the neuroscience. That is just your anterior cingulate cortex sounding the alarm.
It's just an alarm.
It is a biological reflex, no different than pulling your hand off a hot stove. But unlike the stove, this pain is a choice point. In that exact moment when the insula is screaming at you to defend yourself, you get to decide. Are you going to double down, protect the ego, and fall into the trap? Or are you going to drop the rope?
It is the most important, quiet choice we make every single day.
And before we go, I want to leave you with one final, lingering question to ponder on your own. Think about your most fiercely defended belief. The one you argue about the loudest, the opinion you post about most aggressively, the hill you are absolutely willing to die on.
Yeah, we all have one.
Does that conviction truly come from an objective analysis of the truth? Or is it actually just the unhealed scar tissue of a massive past decision that you are simply too terrified to admit was a mistake? Keep questioning your own mind. We'll see you on the next Deep Dive.